Euphoria. That was the overwhelming feeling in Boston, Massachusetts in September of 1918. The Red Sox had just won the World Series, and the proud people of Boston had no reason not to think that the city would continue to thrive. They were wrong. The 1918 baseball season was forced to end prematurely due to World War I's work or fight order, which forced the season to end on September 1st. Due to the uncertainty surrounding the early end, the series was marred by players threatening to strike due to low gate receipts. The Red Sox won the series in thrilling fashion in 6 games, but while the people of Boston were celebrating their victory, a silent killer was sneaking through their streets and infiltrating their homes, and by the time it was done, no one would ever be the same again. World War I was ending in Europe, and Boston Harbor was a hustling and bustling port for troops returning home and a major exchange location for those moving on to other ports. What these masses of people did not know is that along with them, they brought a stowaway, a creeping death. Though the first wave of the Great Flu pandemic had already killed thousands in Europe, a deadlier second wave was mutating. Unfortunately, it was the armed forces themselves that played a crucial role in the spread of the virus. The Navy would spread the flu from coast to coast on their troop ships, with cramped conditions seemingly designed to spread the flu. In the Army, the tight quarters guaranteed the rapid spread of any respiratory illness. The trains, the sleeping quarters, and the planes used by traveling soldiers were a breeding ground for the rapidly growing pandemic. The symptoms in 1918 were so unusual that initially the influenza was misdiagnosed as dengue fever, cholera, or typhoid. One observer wrote that one of the most striking of the complications was hemorrhage from the mucous membranes, especially from the nose, the stomach, and intestines. Bleeding from the ears and petechial hemorrhages in the skin also occurred. The majority of the deaths were from bacterial pneumonia, but the virus also killed people directly, causing massive hemorrhages and edema in the lungs. It was not unusual for an individual to be perfectly healthy one day, then fall ill the next day, some bleeding out right in the middle of the street. During this time, it was the calming and heroic action of the Boston Police Department that kept the city from falling apart. Long before the days of ambulances and EMTs, it would be the police that would respond to the sick and the dying, whether it would be on the street or on a ship of refugees. One of the most incredible aspects of this heroism is that if a policeman were to contract the flu and die, this was not considered to be in the line of duty. No. The police and medical personnel who collected the dead, prepared them for burial, and interred them, found themselves overwhelmed. The accumulation of corpses only served to create opportunities for secondary epidemics. But as quickly as the flu spread throughout the world, it just as quickly disappeared. One theory for the rapid decline is that the doctors simply got better at preventing and treating the virus, but another theory holds that the virus mutated extremely rapidly to a less lethal strain. It left in its path between 50 and 100 million people dead worldwide. As far back as 1916, Boston was dealing with the ramifications of radical communists. On December 16th, Alfonso Fagatti, a follower of anarchist Luigi Galliani, was arrested for stabbing a policeman during a riot in Boston's North Square. The next day, Gallianis exploded a bomb at the Salutation Street station of the Boston Harbor Police. In January of 1919, the city was rocked by the explosion of a large molasses storage tank in the North End. Over 2 million gallons of molasses flooded the street in a wave 15 feet high. The rush had sufficient enough force that it broke girders on the adjacent elevated railway structure. Nearby buildings were swept off their foundations and crushed. 21 people were killed and over 150 injured in the mayhem. The Boston Police, the Red Cross, Army, and Navy personnel responded to the disaster, tending to the wounded, some diving into the molasses to rescue the injured. It took 4 days before they stopped searching for victims. Many of the dead were so glazed over in molasses they were hard to recognize. The cause of the accident is still not known with any certainty, though some experts have the opinion that structural defects and unseasonably warm temperatures contributed to the disaster. But since molasses was a key component in the manufacturing of munitions at the time, the popular theory was that the explosion was caused by anarchists. This theory was later dispelled, however the fear of terrorist actions continued. The climate in the year following the end of World War I was one filled with immense fear that was instilled by government and business propaganda. A communist takeover was the common fear whenever any kind of protest was given or any organized labor movement was uncovered. In 1919 alone, nearly one-fifth of the country's workers would strike. New York harbor workers would strike in January, followed shortly thereafter by the dressmakers. In Seattle, the dock workers struck, and later in the year, a steelworkers' strike slowed the return of the nation's economy to normal peacetime functioning. There were many labor and social issues that occurred during this time. In January of 1919, 35,000 shipyard workers in Seattle went on strike looking for higher wages. They appealed to other local unions for support, and within 2 weeks more than 100 unions and 60,000 total strikers agreed to begin their strike on February 6th. Seattle's normal activities like streetcar service, schools, and ordinary commerce were paralyzed. The strike later collapsed because labor leadership viewed it as a misguided tactic from the start. The Overman Committee was a special 5-man Senate subcommittee first charged with investigating German subversion during World War I. Its mandate was extended the day after the Seattle shipyard workers' strike began. Its goal was to study any efforts being made to propagate in this country the principles of any party exercising or claiming to exercise any authority in Russia, and any effort to incite the overthrow of the government of this country. The committee's hearings into Bolshevik propaganda developed an alarming image of imminent threat. The press further fueled the fear of communism with such headlines as Red Peril Here and Planned Bloody Revolution. In September, though the AFL opposed it, 98% of the steel industry's workers voted to strike. The strike shut down more than half the steel industry in the country. The owners turned public opinion against the AFL by claiming that the steelworkers' strike was masterminded by radicals and revolutionaries. They also played on the fears by noting the large number of immigrant steelworkers. State and local authorities backed the steel companies. Mass meetings were prohibited, picket lines were attacked by police, and thousands were jailed. Martial law was declared in Gary, Indiana due to the clashes between the police, the strikebreakers, and the Unionists. Steel companies turned towards strike-breaking and rumor-mongering to help demoralize the picketers. Congress conducted investigations into radical influence upon union activity, and it was the campaign of negativity that ultimately collapsed the strike. The United Mine Workers announced a strike to commence on November 1st. The workers had had a wage agreement that ran until the end of World War I, and they now sought to capture some of their industry's wartime gains. Attorney General Mitchell invoked the Lever Act, a wartime measure that made it a crime to interfere with the production or transportation of necessities. This law was meant to punish hoarding and profiteering during wartime, and it had never been used against a union. Palmer was confident that his injunction would get united political backing and public support. The day after he obtained his injunction, 400,000 coal workers struck. Owners charged that communist leaders Lenin and Trotsky ordered and financed the strike. The press also echoed those sentiments with words like insurrection and Bolshevik revolution being used as propaganda against the strikers. United Mine Workers leader John L. Lewis called for an end to the strike after criminal charges were filed against him. Though many strikers ignored his action and continued to strike, supplies were running low and public sentiment was calling for stronger action, so a final agreement came in December. In April of 1919, police authorities discovered a plot for mailing 36 bombs to prominent members of the U.S. political and economic establishment. On May 1st, the labor workers celebrated their annual May Day celebration across the world.
In the year of 1919, there were especially large demonstrations to celebrate the labor movement. Violence broke out at the normally peaceful parades in Boston, New York, and Cleveland. In Boston, the police tried to stop a march that didn't have a permit. Both sides fought for the possession of the socialist red flags, and Boston policeman Adolf Butterman was killed in the melee. A mob attacked the socialist headquarters later that day, and the police arrested 114 socialists. Police Captain Hugh Lee died of a heart attack due to the stress, though he's not officially listed as a victim of the riots. In June, 8 more bombs exploded simultaneously in 8 different cities. Of these bombs, one was intended for Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, and another for Massachusetts State Representative Leland Powers, who along with other intended victims were government officials who had endorsed anti-sedition laws and the deportation of immigrants suspected of crimes or associated with illegal movements. The Attorney General soon commanded the Palmer raids from 1919 to 1920 in an attempt by the U.S. Department of Justice to arrest and deport radical leftists from the U.S. His raids included over 30 prominent cities in the U.S., to include Boston. The affected suffered beatings, bad prison conditions, and government threats. And although the ferocity of his approach struck fear in the heart of those would-be radicals, his support would soon crumble as his methods were called into question. The lines between legitimate labor movements and radicalism continued. In Massachusetts, textile workers in Lawrence walked out in protest of 6-day, 9-hour workday schedules. Boston telephone operators interrupted much of New England's phone service in an April walkout, and in July, Boston's elevated train workers left their jobs in protest. But no event struck more fear in that chaotic year than the Boston police strike. For the Boston police officer in 1919, life was anything but good. New officer pay had not risen in 63 years when the pay was only $2 a day. They worked 10-hour shifts and often slept at the station in case they were needed. They worked 7 days a week with a day off every other week, during which they could not leave town without permission. Depending on duty, some officers worked up to 90 hours a week, having to sleep between double shifts in rat-infested station houses that lacked sanitation, baths, beds, and toilets. Pistols and uniforms were not provided by the department, as officers were required to purchase them themselves. Court appearances were also deemed part of the job and not paid for. All of these factors, plus the unfortunate ramifications of the flu pandemic, led directly to their feeling of hopelessness and anger. Police management structure was altered in the years before the strike. In 1895, the department's control was removed from the mayor and replaced by a 5-man board of commissioners appointed by the governor. In 1906, that board was replaced by a single commissioner, still under the control of the governor. The mayor had the responsibility for the pay and working conditions of the department, but the commissioner controlled department operations, along with the hiring, training, and discipline of the police officers. There was also a distinct ethnic issue within the department as well. Protestant management officials sought to control the Irish Catholic rank-and-file members of the department. This made the dispute more than just about wages and working conditions. The Boston police force was growing increasingly angry over the lack of attention to their grievances. They formed the Boston Social Club with the anticipation of becoming a union. The AFL had begun to accept police organizations into their membership in June, and by September had granted charters to police unions in 37 different cities. But since 1918, the new police commissioner had made it clear that they were not entitled to form their own union. Edwin Upton Curtis refused to deal with the social club and set up his own grievance committee to handle management-employee disputes. In August, the Boston Social Club was granted a union charter by the AFL. Commissioner Curtis immediately issued a general order forbidding police officers to join any organization, club, or body outside the department, making an exception only for patriotic organizations like the American Legion. He opposed the union on the grounds that police officers were not an employee but a state officer. On August 17th, the Central Labor Union of Boston welcomed the police union. They also denounced Curtis for his assertions that the police had no right to unionize. Curtis refused to meet with the 8 members of the police union's committee and then suspended them and 11 others who held various union offices. He then began to schedule trials to determine if they had violated his general order. Mayor Peters sought to find resolve in the situation, so he formed a committee to review the dispute. He chose prominent banker James J. Starro to head the commission. The committee agreed that wages and working conditions required change, but that the need for public safety outweighed the right to collective bargaining. They also recommended that Curtis and the police agree to a union without AFL ties and without the right to strike. Curtis would then need to recognize the union, but it would remain independent and unaffiliated. Starro also recommended that no action be taken against the 19 officers that Curtis had suspended. The Boston Chamber of Commerce backed the committee's decision, as well as 4 out of 5 of Boston's newspapers. With the support of Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, Curtis rejected Starro's proposal. He then proceeded with the department trials of the 19 officers and on September 8th found them guilty of union activity. The police union members then responded that same day by voting 1,134 to 2 in favor of a strike. The strike would start as of the evening roll call the next day, September 9th, 1919, and of the force's 1,544 officers, 1,117 failed to report to work. Coolidge assigned 100 members of the state's Metropolitan Police Department to replace the striking officers, but 58 of them refused to participate and were suspended. 200 Harvard athletes and businessmen were recruited to step in after Mayor Peters' request for the state guard was denied by Coolidge. The governor's position was that volunteers could fill the void, and that the troops would be sent in only if needed. Residents quickly absorbed the reality that their streets were left unguarded. Petty crimes were rampant. Vandals ruled the street and people gambled out in the open. Officers were harassed, both those on strike, now without badge and gun, and those who remained as strikebreakers. Though the strike only became official as of 5:45, by 8 p.m. an estimated crowd of 10,000 gathered in Scully Square. Store windows were broken in the melee, and there was a frenzy of looting, gambling, and mayhem that overtook Boston. Some was just rowdy behavior that scared respectable citizens, throwing rocks at streetcars and overturning street vendor carts. But by morning, the mayor had asked the governor to furnish a state guard, and he eventually provided almost 5,000 troops. The mayor used an emergency clause to take control of the police whenever tumult, riot, and violent disturbance happened within the city. Coolidge reacted by issuing a statement that as governor, the guard would be under his control, and that Coolidge, not Peters, would save Boston. Violence peaked again that evening, but many businesses were better prepared. Some had boarded up, and others stayed open all night with armed guards visible to discourage any would-be criminals. Gamblers played dice openly, and women were victims of purse snatchers. The guard proved extremely inexperienced at handling crowds and were very quick to assert control without regard for loss of life. There was gunfire in South Boston and 2 people were killed, with several others wounded. The calamity was caused by a mix of criminal mischief, angry citizens, and those sympathetic to the strikers. Harvard President Lawrence Lowell and prominent Boston businessmen called on more students to volunteer. The crowds met the volunteers outside the police stations to attack them. Cries were heard of "kill the cops." One of the commanders kept his Harvard volunteers in the station to protect their lives. At Scully Square, there were many confrontations between the replacement police and the crowd. Troops were called in to rescue cornered volunteers and police. Guardsmen were injured by throwing rocks, but the threat of live ammunition and horsemen with swords pushed the crowds back. Scores of rioters, volunteers, replacement policemen, and civilians were injured, and the death total from the chaos ultimately reached 9. Mayor Peters feared that other labor unions would join the police in a joint general strike. He met with other union leaders and had the support of the Central Labor Organization's insider, Jim Timilty, to assure that this would not happen. Partially due to negative propaganda, the police began to lose public sympathy. The strikers were called deserters, traitors, and agents of Lenin. President Woodrow Wilson, speaking from Montana, branded the walkout crime against civilization that left the city at the mercy of an army of thugs. A report from Washington, D.C. included the headline, "Senators think effort to Sovietize the government has started." Senator Henry Cabot Lodge saw the dangers of the national labor movement when he said, "If the American Federation of Labor succeeds in getting hold of the police in Boston, it will go all over the country, and we shall be in measurable distance of Soviet government by labor unions." When Governor Coolidge called the strikers deserters and traitors, the police union answered with the following words: "When we were honorably discharged from the United States Army, we were hailed as heroes and saviors of our country. We returned to our duties on the police force of Boston. Now, though only a few months have passed, we are denounced as deserters, as traitors to our city, and violators of our oath of office. The first men to raise the cry were those who have always been opposed to giving to labor a living wage. It was taken up by the newspapers, who cared little for the real facts. You finally added your word of condemnation. Among us are men who have gone against spitting machine guns single-handed and captured them, volunteering for the job. Among us are men who have ridden with dispatches through shell fire so dense that 4 men fell and only the 5th got through. Not one man of us ever disgraced the flag or his service. It is bitter to come home and be called deserters and traitors. We are the same men who were on the French front. Some of us fought in the Spanish War of 1898. Won't you tell the people of Massachusetts in which war you served?" AFL leader Samuel Gompers recognized that the strike was damaging the public's opinion of the labor movement, so he urged the strikers to return to work. The police accepted his recommendation immediately. On September 12th, Gompers telegraphed Mayor Peters and Governor Coolidge asking that the strikers be reinstated and that all parties agree to wait for an arbitration to honorably adjust a mutually unsatisfactory situation. Coolidge replied with a statement of support for Commissioner Curtis. Gompers telegraphed Coolidge again, this time blaming Curtis for the crisis. Coolidge dismissed the commissioner's behavior as irrelevant because no provocation could justify the police walkout. His public response cemented his reputation. There is no right to strike against the public safety, anywhere, anytime. Governor Coolidge originally stated that he had hoped to reinstate the officers, saying in a telegram to a labor convention that "I earnestly hope that circumstances may arise which will cause the police officers to be reinstated." Nevertheless, over the objections of Mayor Peters, Commissioner Curtis, backed by Coolidge, announced that he planned to recruit a whole new police force. 11,000 men were fired. None ever returned. A new force was created using a pool of World War I veterans. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole strike was that the replacements received everything the strikers originally sought, to include better working conditions, higher salaries, more vacation days, pension plans, uniforms, and equipment. The ramifications of the Boston police strike were far-reaching. The AFL responded to the political pressure experienced during the strike and revoked the charters it had granted to the police unions. The Boston police officers would not form another union until 1965 and would not align themselves again with the AFL until 1998. The nation's fear of radical communism would lessen after the Palmer raids, but continue throughout the rest of the century. Faith in the labor movement would continue to grow into a positive force, away from the shadow of perceived communist ties. Governor Calvin Coolidge gained political momentum from his dealings with the strike, and was elected as vice president in 1920. He eventually succeeded to the presidency upon the death of Warren G. Harding in 1923. And what happened to those noble men of the Boston Police Department? History does not reveal their fate. But then, history is written by the victors. It is up to us to seek out the truth and to understand our past so that their injustice will not be repeated.